One of the better known horological companies of the mid 19th century was Dent Co. Now, Dent Co have got a really interesting history with a real character in the centre of it. Elizabeth Dent wasn't always Elizabeth Dent. In fact, as a young woman, she married Richard Ripon. Richard Ripon was a well known watchmaker and successful horological businessman. But unfortunately, soon after their two sons, Richard and Frederick, were born, Richard died. Now, this left Elizabeth in something of a quandary. She had a horological business, but wasn't allowed at that time to take the business on as her own, and she also had two young sons to look after as well. Elizabeth did something which ultimately saved her family and ensured that she remained within the horological business as well. She married Richard's apprentice, a young man by the name of Edward Dent, and at the time of their marriage, she also convinced him that it would be for the best to rename her sons after him, so they took his surname, thus legitimising her children in the process. This was a really shrewd move on her part because legitimisation was a really big factor in things like succession, wills, that kind of side of things. So what she did in that one move was to ensure that she was back at the heart of the horological business and that also her sons' futures were protected as well. Now, Dent did incredibly well in terms of their horological output. They became very well known for making high quality, reliable clocks, so much so that in 1852, Dent was commissioned to create a clock to chime a bell, Big Ben, in Queen Elizabeth Towers. So, a real accolade, and really goes to show just how well thought of they were in London circles. Unfortunately, Edward didn't make it to see Big Ben chime for the first time. He died in 1853. And just 2 years later, the eldest son Richard also died. Now, Frederick, the younger boy, inherited everything, as it had gone from their father to Richard and then passed straight down to Frederick. Unfortunately, Frederick was known as, and I quote here, an unenthusiastic clockmaker. He wasn't particularly interested in his father's business, but he was quite good at the business side of things. His mother started to step in more and more and take over little bits of the business, and together they did incredibly well for the next few years. Tragedy struck again though. In 1860, Frederick died just 2 years after his wife passed away. Historians believe that this was down to alcoholism, which he'd struggled with on and off for his life, and the death of his own wife simply pushed him over the edge and he was unable to cope. A real tragedy. This woman, Elizabeth Dent, has now lost her first husband, her second husband, both of her sons. Now, as a woman, she wasn't necessarily set to inherit the business, even though there were no other living direct heirs. This is a case that she took to court, and she fought for 4 years to become the owner of Dent Co. In 1864, she was finally not only granted ownership of the company and directorship by default of the company as well, but at that point she also retained the royal appointment, which meant that the palace went to Dent and Co to get their clocks, their watches, etc. Again, a huge achievement for her, and we have to remember that this is in a time that women were not allowed to own business readily. It wasn't common practice, and as I've said, it certainly wasn't common practice for a woman to be able to inherit direct from a son in that way. I mean, this really set the course for women's history in terms of women's business history, because for the first time it was really proved that a woman could come in, inherit, take over, and make a success of the business belonging to the men of the family. And in fact, it was right at the end of the 19th century that I'm going to have to read this because it's not a term I've come across before. They created the Great Galvanic Chronographic Apparatus, and that now sits in Greenwich Royal Observatory. And the purpose of that apparatus is to determine the time of all planetary transits that are observed by the Royal Observatory. Now, Dent Co, they still exist. The business itself, although of course no longer run by Elizabeth, is still in existence and is still very successful. In 2006, they were commissioned to create the new St Pancras clock, so still really very high up there in terms of the horology that they are producing, the public image that they have, and the standing that they have within other horologists based in London. I think it's an amazing story. I'm very interested in women's history in general, and to find women like this at the centre of moving society forward in terms of how women in the workplace are perceived, the treatment of women in the workplace, it's an important history to tell. And when we do find interesting little nuggets like this, it's something I really enjoy sharing with everybody.